So at this time, we're going to have 2 one-hour panels with faculty from 8 programs at the college in which teachers are prepared to teach literacy. The first panel focuses on our approaches to pre-service teacher education, and the second on in-service. Panelists will introduce themselves and make a short introduction to their program's approach. The genesis of this panel began at our Teacher Educators Collaborative meeting when we became concerned about how university-based teacher education literacy preparation was being erroneously described by numerous media outlets. We're also concerned about the false binary being sold on literacy learning and the lack of actual scholarship being shared with the public. This panel is our first step in working to bring wisdom and nuance to the conversation about how best to prepare teachers of reading. And we want to suggest, tip of the hat to Susan Masulo, that all teachers are, or should be, can be, will be teachers of reading. Finally, we want to underscore how critical it is for teachers to be fully prepared to use our professional knowledge to meet all learners' widely divergent needs. There is no system or curriculum or approach that can do that. It's teachers who are prepared to carefully assess each learner's reading profile who make the difference. At TC, our literacy instructors focus on putting children and youth and their learning at the center of our pedagogy. So, I have my timer. We have to stay within 5 minutes each. As you prepare new teachers to be teachers of reading, what are the most important skills, concepts, and approaches you want to leave them with? And make sure to say what program you're.
Hi, everyone. I'm Kara Hollins. I'm a lecturer in the Elementary Inclusive Program. I'll give you just a little bit of background about our program before I answer the question. The Elementary Inclusive Program is a 44-credit pre-service program, and it meets New York State's dual certification in childhood education and teaching students with disabilities in grades 1 through 6. We prepare teachers to work with all children, particularly those from marginalized communities who experience form of exclusion in schools. A unique feature of our program is that it includes a required 3-course literacy sequence. And our 3 literacy courses are designed to teach pre-service teachers to pursue competence and to engage in an assets-based relational approach to teaching. So the complexities of inclusive teaching often require educators to navigate competing ideologies, and this is especially true for the teaching of reading. In our program, we view the teaching of reading as a sociocultural practice. We use the term reading to mean reading comprehension, and we use the words decoding and word recognition to mean just that. We support the use of code-based and meaning-based instructional practices to navigate print-based texts. Several frameworks guide our pedagogical approach towards the teaching of pre-service teachers to teach reading, and those 3 are adaptive teaching, responsive instruction, and the active view of reading model. So with adaptive teaching, it's a framework that really informs reading curriculum design. It's an approach we want pre-service teachers to understand and to enact in their teaching of reading. An adaptive teaching framework includes valuing students as individuals, being flexible, designing authentic literacy experiences, and connecting students' cultural and linguistic strengths to reading instruction. Adaptive teaching aligns with culturally responsive pedagogies, and according to Vaughan, Massey, and Parsons, adaptive teachers use their knowledge of reading acquisition to design learning experiences that match students' instructional needs and reflect their rich backgrounds, literacies, and cultures. We want our graduates to be adaptive teachers, teachers who can be decision makers for their students, and who take a critical stance towards one-size-fits-all teaching of reading. Within an adaptive teaching framework, we teach pre-service teachers to engage in responsive reading instruction. And reading responsive instruction, as described by Gelsheiser, Scanlon, and colleagues, has to do with the process of a teacher collecting information about what students can know and can do and what they need to learn next. So in order to engage in responsive reading instruction, we teach our pre-service teachers how to assess students' literacy practices and skills. We also teach them how to use observational and assessment data to develop multiple pathways to support our students as they access and interact with meaningful texts. So in all of our literacy courses, we include learning objectives related to reading development and instructional practices. Some of the constructs of reading that students explore in our courses are, but are not limited to, the alphabetic principle, comprehension, fluency, morphological awareness, phonics knowledge, phonological awareness, print concepts, sight word recognition, strategy use, text and language structures, vocabulary development, content knowledge, writing, as well as assistive technology, augmentative and alternative communication, both of which are mechanisms that can support the learning and communication of these constructs. So we draw upon the active view of reading model, a relatively newer reading model by Duke and Cartwright, to represent the relationship among and between the many constructs of reading. One reason for this model, that we draw on this model, is because it names sociocultural context and the reader's social identity as impactful on the reading process. This model also highlights the importance of active self-regulation, including motivation and engagement in reading. It also frames word recognition and language comprehension as integrated. To sum up, essential skills related to reading that we want graduates of our program to leave with include forming relationships with students. We want them to use students' interests and identities to design reading instruction, using a variety of literacy and reading assessments for instructional purposes. We want our graduates to be reflective and curious and take a learner's stance. We want them to select children's literature critically and purposely and use it to support comprehension. We want our graduates to be able to plan for and use a repertoire of pedagogical approaches to teach students how to make meaning from text. We want them to use varied approaches to word learning, and we want them to build students' knowledge and flexible use of strategies. Lastly, we hope that when our students leave us, they view all students as having literate resources. They reject the notion of a literate, non-literate dichotomy and understand that literacy develops across an individual's lifetime.
Is it on? Okay, great, thank you. Okay, so my name is Maria Hartman, and I am a lecturer and program director in the program in the education for deaf and hard of hearing children here at Teachers College. So in deaf education, there actually is an important body of knowledge, scientifically based, that's really, really helpful for teachers of deaf and hard of hearing children to know about. This body of knowledge is continuously developing, so there's lots of reason to be really, really focused on what's happening in this field for new teachers. The first area is that of auditory development. So that is how the ear works with the brain to make sense of sound, particularly the sounds of spoken language. We know that a typically developing fetus will start hearing its mother's voice at what age? Anybody know? Typically between 25 and 26 weeks, right? So pretty early, a fetus can listen to its mother's voice, and that auditory system will continue to develop throughout the pregnancy so that when the baby's born or right before it's born, it can distinguish between its mother's voice and other voices in the environment. That baby knows its mother's voice when it's born, it prefers it, and it will turn towards the mother's voice over other voices in the environment. So that baby's neural connections that are building language in the brain start before the baby is born, right? When the baby is born and prefers the mother's voice and makes eye contact with the mother, that's the beginning of early communication development. Okay, so that stuff is really important for teachers of the deaf to know. Why? Because when a baby with hearing loss is born, it's born behind in terms of typical language development. So those babies who have hearing loss in the womb are born without all of those prenatal language experiences. So we as teachers need to think about what learning to read will be like for those children. Now, if that baby is lucky enough to be identified through newborn infant screening, and then lucky enough to be fitted with hearing technology, and then lucky enough to have access to good early intervention, that baby can catch up in terms of spoken language development. But that's rarely the case, that it happens that smoothly and that quickly, right? So teachers of the deaf need to understand hearing technology and how those technologies like cochlear implants and digital hearing aids can be programmed to fit a particular child's hearing loss. And the quicker that child starts to have access to spoken language, the quicker that family can work with that baby to develop in a way that will support that child's approach to reading. Let's face it, learning to read a spoken language is easier if you can hear it, right? It's harder if you can't hear it, okay? So the third body of knowledge that's really important for teachers of the deaf is early language development. Teachers of the deaf need to know linguistics, and they need to know about early language development. Typically, hearing children come to school with many, many language experiences before formal reading instruction. We almost take that for granted. Deaf children often don't come to school with complete language experiences. So we as teachers need to think about how we'll work with those kids who are chronologically one age, but linguistically another age. Okay, so those kids come to school disadvantaged in terms of reading readiness. Now, we know a lot of kids come to school disadvantaged, right? So there are other factors that are related to why kids come to school like that. There are SES factors, there are other handicapping conditions. So imagine those with hearing loss on top of it. Okay, so knowing about early childhood development, as Dr. Snow and I were talking over the lunch break, the one-word utterance stage, the two-word utterance stage, and how you move kids past those early language stages, that's not something we typically study as teachers, but teachers of the deaf need to do that. Okay, and when we talk about language development, we're not just talking about the number of words you know, right? There's the 30 million word experiment and the Hart and Riesli. Ooh, okay. Okay, it's what you know about words and how words are used in increasingly complex sentences. Other than those three, or beyond those three ideas, deaf kids need to learn the same things about reading that hearing kids need to know. So all the same things that Kara just mentioned, teachers of the deaf, good assessment, not just standardized assessment, but that kind of day-by-day assessment, and then what we've learned from cognitive psychology about teaching and learning. the value of background knowledge, the importance of review and practice, et cetera, et cetera.
Oh, I can just keep going with this. All right, testing. I think it's still working. Okay, good afternoon. My name is Joanne Delgado. I'm a lecturer in the program in Applied Behavior Analysis. Just a little bit of background on our program. We certify teachers in both general and special education from early childhood through grade 6. Our goal as faculty in our program is to teach our teachers to be equipped with scientifically based pedagogical tools to teach all learners to become accurate, fluent, and engaged readers. There are 3 approaches that we really draw from. Reading is embedded in all of our course sequences. Our students also take a course with Dr. Susan Masola, who will be a panelist later. And so the simple view of reading is one approach that we utilize in our program. We also use a verbal behavior developmental approach. With that approach, we teach teachers about communicative developmental milestones that are necessary for students to learn to read. A core component of the curriculum for our teachers is to learn this sequence from early childhood forward. This allows teachers to arrange instruction that is accessible based on each individual student's learning histories. Teachers learn that even with the best research-based teaching practices and materials, if a child is missing a milestone or more than one, learning to read will be a challenge. So it's critical that we teach them how to establish these missing milestones by drawing upon empirically research-based tactics and procedures. In addition, we coined the term strategic science of teaching and practices as it applies to reading. This is a major component of our teaching practices with our teachers. This includes a system to reliably measure and implement evidence-based practices for teaching reading. It includes continuous analysis of student learning and their own teaching. It comes from either troubleshooting, learning difficulties based on many different factors, such as their learning history, their environment, as well as continuing to advance students that are learning is also very critical in this model. The literacy component that we prioritize, obviously, is the early language experience and development, building from what Dr. Maria Harton just spoke about. We really want our teachers to be aware of what their students' speaker and listener responses and how that plays a role in their reading instruction, so building on those communicative developmental milestones. We also talk about structured literacy. We want to be aware of phonemic awareness, phonics, blending is really a critical component, fluency, sight word instruction, vocabulary development and comprehension. We want our teachers to be able to teach students to be able to comprehend with explicit, implicit, as well as evaluative learning experiences where they're able to join their own experiences from the world around them into their reading instruction. Another core feature, while we are teaching, of course, the structural components of reading, the alphabetic principles, is the function of reading. We place a big emphasis on teaching teachers how to teach students to learn and value reading and become motivated for reading. So it's a really core feature. And with our strategic science of teaching model, we're able to develop procedures to measure and reliably measure and also implement procedures so they do value reading, and we see students then acquire that value for reinforcement and learn exponentially quicker. What are skills, specific skills that we want our teachers to be fluent with, and when they leave our program, we want them to be really equipped with the different types of reading assessments that are available in their schools. We try to really work with their school that they're placed in and identify the different curricular materials and assessments they're using, but also provide multiple exemplars for them so they're ready to use those assessments, but most importantly, use the assessments in a way that can inform their instruction in the best way possible so their students can learn. We also work with, because we work with a diverse range of learners, we also teach them how to use diverse intervention curriculum and procedures. And that includes developmental protocols for those students that are missing those communicative milestones that I spoke about earlier. Our teachers are also, we teach them how to use explicit instruction, especially at the foundational level for reading. So when students are learning to read, how to do step-by-step instruction following a reading sequence tied to the core objectives and what standards are being used in their schools, how to model and how to provide direct instruction for the individual learners. We want our teachers to be really systematic in their planning, sequential, and we want them to really be instructional designers. So when they're out there, they can tackle whatever curriculum they're given and the students that they're working with. And with that, we use a lot of positive practice based on the principles and science of behavior. So we teach them how to make the learning environment a positive reinforcement environment, as well as to deliver effective feedback with reading instruction, which will result hopefully in in more learning. Along with reliable measurement, we cannot not talk about continuous analysis, hence our program description name, behavior analysis. So we're constantly teaching our students to analyze all aspects of instruction. So whether it's looking at the types of texts that are used for older learners to early learners, looking at the curriculum materials that they're using. And with the measurement, our teachers can individualize the scientific practices to work for that particular student, drawing on those tools. Our analysis in terms of instruction, we teach our teachers is cyclical. So we start with the planning, and then we move forward to execution, making sure those pedagogical tactics are in place. And we conclude with going back to that planning, whether the student is learning or not learning. And our main premise of our model is that teaching is not complete until the student has learned, so that process continues. And that's a really important component of our model. And I'll leave with what our teachers, we want them to leave with knowing that effective reading instruction is a form of social justice. So we appreciate everyone being here and being part of this panel and for this reason. Thank you.
What a beautiful ending, thank you. I'm Sarah Kreider. I'm a lecturer in the TESOL program, so that's Teaching English to Speakers of Other Languages. Many of you may know this, but TESOL in New York State is a certification for pre-K through 12th grade. So you can imagine there's a lot of different kinds of learning how to teach reading that happens in our program. So I'm going to talk about one fundamental mindset and two primary skill sets, just to keep this relatively simple. The mindset, I think, has actually been beautifully described already today, but it's so important, let me say it again. We start with conversations about what does it mean to teach reading? What are we teaching when we're teaching reading? It's not one thing. So there's no single pathway to learning how to read, and what we really hope that our teachers take is the idea that we need to meet our students where they are, figure out what strengths they're bringing into the reading process, and then what their next step is in that process. So that takes me then to the first skill set that I want to mention, which is close observation, looking and listening, and interacting with individual students and using that interaction to inform our choices. So just to give one concrete example, actually I'm going to give two. Our students need to have a very strong set of linguistic skills and knowledge, including the sound system of English, similar to your work. You may be working with a younger student, if you're a TESOL teacher, who seems to be struggling with basics of sound letter correspondence. And in fact, what's happening is that that child has sound letter correspondence down in their home language, right? And the issue is actually one that relates to learning a new sound system, right? So in that case, the teacher needs to listen closely to the oral production of the student and use what they hear from the student to figure out what is actually happening with that individual student. Another place where we use close observation is we prepare our teachers to work with students with limited or interrupted formal schooling. This is a growing population in New York, across the world, actually, right? And these are often students in middle school or high school who have had lives that have not included formal schooling. They may have been in a refugee camp. They may have had to leave school early in order to work to support their families. So we're talking about students with enormous amounts of lived experience, often with enormous practical knowledge, and in many cases with limited experience with literacy in any language, in their home language and in English. So the first question is, figuring out if that's what's happening with a particular student. And here we teach our teachers to do things like look at the eyes, notice where students are looking. So if you give a student a text with images and text, do they look to the images or do they look to the text? That's really important information. Right? We also want to look very closely for signs of anxiety when reading and writing enter the picture. I think we all know about the research about what an impact anxiety has on learning. And if you're a student with limited experience with formal schooling and you find yourself in a high school classroom and you're handed a text, anxiety is going to be part of that picture. And that's something our teachers need to recognize and work with. That leads us then to the other skill set I want to mention, which is modification. So if we look at a student with limited or interrupted formal schooling, they may need to work on real fundamental pieces of teaching reading, like phonemic awareness. They don't need texts and materials that are designed for 5-year-olds, right? That's not just inappropriate, it's actually damaging. So our students need to know how to modify materials so that they are appropriate for the students that they are working with, or how to create their own materials, or how to find materials. One other place where we work on the skill of modification is in literacy across the content areas. So again, with students as they move forward in their reading journey, we need to work with our students as they learn how to read a lab report for science, which is radically different from learning how to read a poem in English class, which is different from learning how to read a text in social studies class. So our teachers need to know how to look at the grammar and syntax of these different kinds of texts, at how they are organized, at their purpose. You know, we need to also look at the ways that texts are culturally appropriate or not, the way they bring people in or push them away, and then appropriately modify texts so that our language learners can work with them and learn from them, and then eventually critique them. You know, I feel like I can't talk about teaching reading without also talking about critique. We want our teachers to be able to critique the materials they're given, the texts they're given, to look at them with a critical eye, and then to have the skill of teaching critique as well, at all levels of reading.
Dr. Kreider wins the 5-minute prize. So, you know, I'm sitting here feeling pretty grateful to work at a university. I think you can hear, maybe not overtly, but subversively, is that the right word, underneath these presentations, some paradigmatic differences, some significant frame differences, and some shared values. This is what we need. We need places of universities where knowledge can be put side by side and discussed. So I want to invite you, it's a little off script. Do you have any questions for each other before I move on to what we prepared? Modeling that criticality. And you know, this is while they're thinking and getting up their nerve to say something. This is why when media say teacher educators don't do a good job of preparing people to be teachers of reading, I want to pull my hair out. Because you know, there is no such one thing as called teacher education preparing for reading. It's like Dr. Snow said earlier, we don't even know what's going on, right? So you say, I want to come to Teachers College and learn how to be a teacher. You're a principal. How many principals or school leaders here? Yeah, you're interviewing someone from Teachers College. You don't actually know what their literacy curriculum was unless you know their program. And even then, the programs evolve over time. So, okay, enough of a blah, blah. Anybody want to ask any question of each other? Or of the group? Okay, I'll go. Oh.
Go ahead. From several of you, I'd love to hear more about reading and social justice in your program.
Okay, a little slow. Okay, so reading and social justice. We really do believe that every student should have access to reading instruction. And through our science of teaching model, we really work to build. We teach so many diverse students. We have students coming from different socioeconomic backgrounds. We have students with autism spectrum disorders. We have general education students. So our approach in terms of effective reading instruction and social justice, and I think Dr. and Catherine Snow presented some really nice, interesting data, really brilliant presentation in terms of I think brings up though the questions of the inequity. So our teachers really need to be well versed in understanding. And I think Kara, I think you spoke about, I think everyone spoke about students at some point or had conversations. Really looking at students' interests and their backgrounds is critical in terms of how we address reading instruction. And if you're not doing that and you're just kind of following the script or the published curriculum, I think we're not really approaching what we need to be approaching, giving every student an opportunity to learn to read. So I don't know if that helps address the question. I don't know if anyone wants to add to that.
Yeah, I think it's good for everybody to add to that.
I'll just say that, well, knowing the other panelists, but also listening to their descriptions of their programs here today, I think we have a lot more in common than differences. We all work with specific populations of children, and those populations have specific needs, and it's only right that we try our best to address those needs while also doing the hard work of teaching them to read, and that part I don't think is so different.
And in our program, we see inclusive education as a political act. We are working towards social justice. And, we think about social justice in terms of how it informs the selection of our materials in our social studies methods class. We talk about it in our disability and exclusion class. So social justice really undergirds all that we do in our program. Sarah, what about you?
So I shouldn't. Is it safe? Yeah. Okay. I shouldn't have to say this. But of course, we have to look at the texts that we are bringing into a classroom. Do the images of the students look like our students? I'm thinking about skin color, I'm thinking about family background, I'm thinking about languages. Do students see themselves in the text? This seems obvious. There's an enormous amount of research about how important this is, and we still need to keep talking about it. So for me, that's kind of the foundation. We also think about the interaction that happens in the classroom, the give and take. Who's speaking and who isn't speaking, right? And one of the skills, this goes back to that skill of observation, we want our teachers to notice who's speaking and who isn't speaking. And this does relate directly to reading. I think Dr. Snow talked about the incredible importance of the intertwining of interaction, conversation, and working with written texts. And then again, on a more kind of technical level, as people who work with language, spoken language and written language are deeply intertwined. So we really need to think about who has the opportunity to use language in a classroom and who doesn't. So that's just one additional, I think, fundamental piece of kind of a concrete way of thinking about social justice and language.
To add to your list of kids need to see children who look like them, who talk like them, I'll add disability there. Of course, that's how we complement each other. It's not enough time in this forum for me to talk about sign language. That's a whole other part of deaf identity that plays a role. Not exactly gonna work in a couple of minutes, but kids with disabilities should see themselves in the books they read too.
Since I've been a teacher for my whole life, I want to add in just on a personal level, not only is it important, I think, for children to see themselves, it's important for children to see other people. So it's not just because I'm teaching in an all-African-American school on the south side of Chicago like I did for many years, but it's because, well, I never taught at a rich white school, but the rich white school kids, as part of social justice is having them understand that various forms of English are English and are there's not like a standard and a not standard. You know, it's not like standard and dialect. So everybody needs to be able to read different dialects, right? We need to be able to talk to each other, for goodness sake. And there isn't one right way to talk. Anyway, don't get me started. Since we're like, I want to get a little more, you know, we're all being polite. What are you seeing out there in classrooms? I know all of you spend time in classrooms. Our students have assignments that you give them, and they then go do them in the classroom, and then they bring them back, and then sometimes you go observe your students. Can you talk about some of the things you're seeing lately that you want to put on the radar as concerning around literacy practices?
I think one of the concerning things that I'm seeing, and we do really try, as I said earlier, integrate their experiences in their schools. We form partnerships with what we're doing in the university, but at the same time, we're seeing a lot of time limits or time spent on specific instruction, which is not, and I think that has been a practice of the past, but being a little bit more, I think, rigorous in terms of the scheduling, and students really not, with that, the teacher cannot be as flexible, right? And all those individualization approaches that we've all talked about today, that can be really challenging. It's like, oh, Dr. Delato, I know I have to do this, but I have to do 25 minutes of this, and this may not be the right for this learner, or they need, given their background, this much more time for this specific explicit instruction. So how do I fit that in? So that's something I don't know if other panelists have found.
I have as well. In the spring, I teach a course called Literacy Supports. It's the first course in our 3-course literacy sequence. And students in the class work with school-age students one-on-one for the whole semester. And this semester, similarly, you know, we would have students carve out time, 15 minutes twice a week, to work with their students one-on-one for coursework purposes. But students are coming back to class saying the same thing. I'm doing, you know, they're saying to me, I'm required to do a whole class phonological awareness lesson or a whole class phonics lesson, and that has to be 30 minutes a day, so I don't have the time to do such and such. So we're definitely seeing that as well.
I mentioned older students who are language learners, and we've seen a rise of our student teachers being asked to work with these students on phonics, phonological awareness, which is appropriate, but in ways that are really distressing, in that they're being given materials that are really appropriate for very young learners, and they're being asked to use them in a scripted way. So there's very little sense of the incredible cognitive skills that a 15-year-old brings into the classroom. Imagine a 15-year-old who brought his whole family across the border from another country. The life skills, the number skills, the map reading skills, and that child is being, or that adolescent actually, is being asked to do some sort of like dancing stuffed animal bears, right? It's damaging, and it's a case of kind of not looking at, you know, I think you talked about this, Dr. Snow. It's when the regulations don't match the reality, right? And it's not that the students don't need these skills, it's that they need them to be taught in a way that is appropriate for them, right? And we also see a rise in scripted, kind of required scripted teaching. And as a linguist, a conversation analyst, this is very distressing because language learning happens via complex, rich, human, responsive interaction. That's how our brain functions. That's who we are as humans. And scripting isn't that. So that's another thing that I think really doesn't match the realities of how we learn.
Add quickly from the other perspective, from the perspective of the classroom teacher, 85% of deaf and hard of hearing children now go to school in regular classrooms. So they're in classrooms with typically developing children. They might be in ICT classes, but they still have very specific needs. And I really feel for these teachers who have 30 kids in a classroom with maybe 12 different IEPs, all representing different disabilities with different needs. So So it was seeing a lot of, you know, just getting through the day versus really addressing individual kids' needs.
I'm sure there's teachers in the audience who could give you a very long, long list of the barriers that prevent them from being able to do the kinds of instruction that they leave their university classrooms with. And I think it's really, this is the commercial editorial piece of the day. I think teacher educators were the majority of the people in the room right now, and educators also. We need to be way more publicly active. We, you know, in New York City, we need to be screaming and yelling about class sizes. In the United States, we need to be screaming and yelling about why are we one of only 3 industrialized countries in the world that doesn't fund education, right? Talk about social justice, right? Social justice, why should your school be tied to your zip code, tied to your real estate values, right? It doesn't make any sense. It's fundamental. So one of the things at Teachers College is we revere teachers. We revere them, and our hearts are breaking watching what's happening in some schools, with some school leaders also having to make terrible decisions and terrible choices. So the more of us who have the privilege of being able to speak out, who can start speaking out, letters to the editor, letters to op-ed pieces, you know, city council, speaking up, looking at the legislation that's coming up in New York State right now, the right to read legislation, looking at Congressman Jamal Bowman's more teaching, less testing bill that's in front of Congress. So there's lots of activism that we would like to help lead. One of the things that we've been talking about as a faculty is how do we help defend public education, and particularly the teachers that are really beleaguered at this point in time. It takes a lot of real moral courage to be facing everything that teachers in New York City, particularly, I know that context the best, are facing. So, wrapping up, can you talk about one specific assignment that you do where you ask people to go do something in the classroom and then bring it back?
I mentioned this earlier. So for literacy supports, students work one-on-one with a student in their student teaching placement. So I should add that in all of our literacy courses are paired with fieldwork. So 2 of the courses, students are in 2 different student teaching placements, and the last course, literacy for students with significant disabilities, they're doing a 2-day practicum in District 75 classrooms. So for this assignment, students work one-on-one with a reader. They get to know that reader. They get to know their interests, who they are. And as a part of that, they design instruction. But one other sub-piece of that is designing a text set. So they take a student's interest, one of their interests that they've expressed, and they find a plethora of books on that topic. And they read it closely, and they think about text level, and they think about instructional practice and how they would introduce that text. And they design this text set for this student, and they use it in their one-on-one instruction. And so this happens back in our classroom space. They get together and they talk together about the text sets that they're building. They talk about their students. They talk about the assessments that they're doing. So there's this collaborative energy around it. And then they take that and they bring it back into their classroom space. And I have to say that it's so successful. Students love that they can bring these texts that kids are really interested in and spend time looking through, even if it's just reading captions. But it's a really wonderful project.
There are so many, I don't know which one to pick. But in one of our courses, our reading in the content areas, we ask students to find children's literature that's at an appropriate reading level for their students to include in every social studies, science, and math unit. So even if it's just one book to sort of introduce the topic, or maybe it's a book that can be used throughout the unit to explore not only content, but language concepts. You know, what can we learn about reading by looking at this text as we are learning content? So those kinds of things, we bring them back into our classrooms so that we can share them and so that we can build each other's knowledge of children's literature and how they're used, how books are used to help children learn to read, as well as help children expand their language base.
So one of the projects we use, and I use this project pretty much throughout my courses, and our courses are, our methods course and a student teaching practicum are closely taught together. So we have a curriculum analysis project where the teachers pick a lesson that they're going to teach in reading, and they, similar to what Kara said, they do a whole deep dive in with what the student's background information, what prerequisites they have, what objective they're going to teach. They videotape their lesson, and we've done a lot here at TC with that, and we watch it back together. And we look at where the student has learned, look at those interactions, the student with the teacher, and then I ask them questions. We ask about were the curriculum materials correct, and they come prepared with their answers, and we go back and we plan for a next step. So that's a big piece of our curriculum for teachers.
Gosh, okay, so in our methods course for working with students who are in grades 7 to 12, the students in that class are either doing field work or student teaching. And they start the class by doing a genre analysis, and they need to choose a genre that their students, or the students that they're observing, are actively using, or that is, is part of their life. So that might be something like a reader's response. It might be a resume for 11th graders. It might be an Instagram post. So the key thing is that it's a genre that students have a connection with, that they need to use. And then the students in the methods course need to find a set of real-life examples of that genre. They then need to produce an example of the genre themselves, because boy, do you ever learn about a genre when you have to write it, right? And then they have to analyze it closely, and that includes everything from looking at what kinds of sentence structures, what types of vocabulary do we see in that genre, to is it a gatekeeping genre? Do we see, if we're looking at resumes, what do we know about gender and names and language and resumes, right? How is the genre organized? So all different kinds of ways of looking at that text, which then sets the students up to develop a unit where they teach that genre based on what they learned about it in their analysis.
Wait for the little green light to come on. Thank you so much to four of our pre-service people. And I want to say that a lot of these conversations that we're starting to have come in no small part because we're designing teacher residency programs in collaboration with District 4. And we are designing dual certification programs, so TESOL plus elementary ed, teaching students with disabilities plus science methods. And I think the cross-fertilization that we're starting to create here is really important. So thank you very much.
On. Okay.
You can leave them on, no problem. Okay.
Okay. Thank you.
Yeah. And I'm just gonna switch this one out so you can have it work.
Like a really bad feedback.
I hear you. In the beginning, that was
Do you want this one? Is this an extra one? I'm not sure.
This one should be working.
So I'm sure that, I imagine that some of you have questions for the panelists and potentially questions for Professor Snow. And so at 2 o'clock we're doing the town hall meeting, and that's when we'll really be able to have you invited into this whole conversation. And it turns out you can leave the microphones on.
We can always learn.
Yes. Okay, thank you so much. So, kind of fairly arbitrarily, since we had 8 programs doing literacy teacher education, and we knew 8 people is too much for a panel, we divided into 2. So this group of panelists are going to be focusing more on in-service teachers. So if you could each take your 5 minutes and describe your work with in-service teachers and school leaders, and in that work, tell us what is your focus, your main goals, and your ways of working with them. Also begin by telling us what program you're in, and if it's if it's relevant, you can talk about your research projects that you're involved in with the in-service teachers also.
So I'm honored to talk about, I'm Lucy Calkins, and I'm honored to talk about the Literacy Specialist Program that I co-direct with Maria Polagiso. Our program certifies grad students not only as teachers, but also as curriculum leaders and as literacy coaches. Our graduates are principals, literacy coaches, directors of language arts, teachers of pre-K, teachers of middle school. So one of the things that we know from Presley and other research is that effective schools are characterized by a strong collaborative community of practice where people are engaged in inquiry together and doing innovations, to use Tom Newkirk's term. So Maria Paula and I really want those collegial relationships to exist throughout our program. The first night of this last year, students got on a text thread together, and apparently they were writing, the whole entire program was writing to each other pretty much every day, sometimes 2 or 3 times a day, and that kind of networking continues after they leave here. Because collaborative communities of practice are so important to us, there's a lot of group work in our program, and it starts or centers around the Master's Action Research Project, where our students, in some programs that's done as kind of independent studies, almost like little micro theses, but in our program, our students come together to research shoulder to shoulder with each other. They ask a problem of practice, they read up on it, they develop an innovation, take it to the school, to the children, and watch what happens in result, then come back and cycle through that in a way that we heard earlier from the other panel. Last year, for example, one of our students studied in a classroom full of newcomers from Panama and Venezuela. What did it mean to have storytelling circles in terms of the oral language? Another one of them studied children who wanted to learn languages from each other, learn about the languages that their peers spoke. And always they're learning that this is good teaching, is to be engaged in that kind of community of practice. Maria and Paul and I also want a very big view of reading. Our students study with Susan, which you'll hear about soon, and learn the reading rope, the simple view of reading, study phonemic awareness and phonics, learn to assess readers using different tools and to develop interventions. In another course, they're involved in sociocultural perspectives, learning that language and reading operate differently in different contexts, that it matters with whom you're reading and for whom and why. They learn that print is not the only form of representation, but that you can read images and podcasts. And they study the reading in that course, the reading that's involved not only in school, but also out of school. So do a project on the reading involved in self-checking out at Target or making TikTok videos, and then think about how does that kind of real-world reading map onto what's happening in classrooms, and how can our classrooms be asset-based, recognizing the kinds of complex reading that kids are doing in the real world. They, of course, study children's literature, K through 2, 3 through 8 kinds of children's literature, and ask the kinds of questions that Pearson and Raphael talk about in their new handbook for best practices of literacy education. For example, a question we heard discussed earlier today about text complexity, and thinking, to what extent should we be matching kids with texts that are in their zone of proximal development, where they can be doing, thinking about craft and about structure and reading critically, and to what extent should we be following the advice of standards and making sure that kids, regardless of their reading level, are working with grade level complex texts and trying to use their literacy skills to do that work. They also study disciplinary reading. One of my colleagues, Marjorie Siegel's really interested in reading as a mathematician, reading as a scientist, reading as a historian, and we know that the upcoming NAEP test will be, for the first time, including reading in disciplines. And of course, our students study writing. They learn about progressions in writing, in narrative, opinion, information writing. How do you assess where kids are, where they need to go? One of the big projects is developing curriculum, and they work very, very hard, maybe 20, 30 different drafts of this, and really learn that we are wiser together than we are by ourselves, that that kind of work is so enriched by doing it in the company of others. They're linked to schools, always, and to schools that are places that are really teaching them a lot about literacy. I'm thinking, for example, of PS 249, which is a high-need school in Brooklyn. The principal, Elisa Brown, won the Terrell Bell Award for Outstanding School Leadership, just won the National Center for Urban Transformation Best Elementary School in the Nation Award. Want to just note, it was featured in Dana Goldstein's article from the New York Times, although she neglected to mention the Blue Ribbon or the other awards that the school has won. But in any case, our students are really lucky to be in magnificent schools, and in those schools, the teachers are working in that same kind of community of practice, learning with humility from what kids show them.
Thank you. Thank you. I'm Susan. Is this on? No.
I'm Susan Masulo, and I am in the Reading Specialist program, currently now the Advanced Certificate in Literacy. And it seems, I went back and did some homework about the program, and we have been in existence since Arthur Gates came to Teachers College in 1917.
Wow.
And Gates himself believed that there was probably no one best way to teach reading, but his perspective was that the teaching of reading should be based on methods of instruction which have found to be effective by systematic methods of inquiry.
Yeah.
And we have tried to keep that focus within our teacher preparation program throughout all these years. We use in the program for teacher preparation purposes, I pretty much stick with this simple view of reading, which is much more complex than what people tend to think it is. And I supplement it with Scarborough's reading rope because it makes the simple view equation a little bit more understandable for teacher educators to employ in their practice. I also include, I don't know if Steve Peverly is still here, but I also include a very simplified model of Kinch's model of constructive integrative understanding and comprehension because Walter Kinch is my hero. All right. But going on that, so from the simple view of reading equation, we break reading down. Our focus is on getting teachers to understand how reading actually is acquired and how it can break down. Many of our students go on to teach kids who struggle. They may not be diagnosed as having a reading or learning disability or having dyslexia in particular, but they don't get it the first time around. They need a lot of direct and explicit instruction. So there is a focus on seeing reading as these, what the National Reading Panel would refer to as these 5 pillars, all right, which is 20 years old now, and we know that reading is much more complicated than those 5 pillars. But we are talking about phonological and phonemic awareness. We're talking about word recognition instruction in all facets. We're looking at fluency as a bridge and the bidirectional relationship between fluency and comprehension. We look at all aspects of comprehension, including metacognition, and we look at the reading and writing connection. The capstone, I think, of our program is a practicum experience, where teachers, where our student teachers work. They're not student teachers in the technical sense of the word. We have a practicum. We have a clinic here at Teachers College called the Center for Educational and Psychological Services, which is in the building right next door. And we service children throughout the New York City community who have been referred because they may not necessarily have IEPs, but they're not getting it. They're falling behind in their reading and writing instruction. And a concerned teacher or a concerned parent reaches out. Services are performed on a sliding scale basis with many families paying as little as $5 a semester for services. Students learn to employ a battery of informal assessments, not standardized tests, but informal assessments to get a handle on what these children's strengths are, what their needs are, and how they can plan an intervention program for them that not only addresses their needs, but helps the student to meet the grade level expectations of their current reading and writing placement in their schools. So it's just not a pull-out program where students are just addressing individual needs and that's it. We really try to link what they're learning within the sessions at the center along with what's happening in the student's classroom. That would basically be the capstone of the program itself. There's a lot of discussion about research-based interventions, what can work. One size fits only does not work within our program. And in terms of, you know, the topic about scripts came up before. Like, I've been teaching too long. I don't need a script. You know, if somebody gave me a script, I would ignore it. But when I was a beginning teacher, a script can be very helpful. I mean, if you get into a classroom and you don't know what you're doing, no matter what they told you at Teachers College, right? A script is a little helpful in the beginning until you get your sea legs, all right? But after time, with Teachers College, we'll be able to do is to take, well, you know what? This script is lacking. This script, maybe I can improve on it a little bit from what I know, from what I've learned. So there's something to be said. We don't come out of TC as perfectly knowledgeable teachers, but we do come out of TC with a pretty good idea of what we're supposed to be doing and what we're supposed to be teaching. And I'm very, very proud of all the graduates of my program because I can really say that they know their stuff, all right, and I'm quite pleased with them.
Hello, everyone. I am Carol Schaffner-Hammer. I'm Vice Dean for Research here at Teachers College, as well as a Professor of Communication Sciences and Disorders. And so that means speech-language pathology. So I will be talking, although what we're doing right now is not related to speech-language pathology, but related to language and literacy. So I'll be talking about Excel, our professional development program. Excel stands for Exceptional Coaching for Early Language and Literacy. And so we're a very different program. We are an online program with teachers who are actually in their classrooms. They don't come to TC, but we are an evidence-based professional development program with individualized coaching for pre-K, K, and first grade teachers and assistant teachers. And we really focus on schools in under-resourced communities. What we do in Excel is we train teachers to promote fundamental language skills in English and children's home language, with the emphasis on starting first with home language and then moving to English. We target early languages and early language and these early grades, these early ages, because we know how fundamental oral language is to reading, and we also know by the research that shows that where children are in kindergarten and first grade in their reading skills really predicts where they are later in their academic skills. And so we really need to be supporting children early. I need to give credit. Excel was developed by Barbara Wasick and Anne-Marie Hyman at Temple University. I joined the team just 12 short years ago to bring in my expertise on dual language learners or emergent bilingual children. And so we integrate working with monolingual children as well as multilingual learners at the same time, so teachers aren't viewing children as kind of two sets of children in their classrooms. Excel has been supported by the U.S. Department of Education through its development and testing and various entities within the U.S. Department of Ed, as well as the Robin Hood Foundation. What we were really trying to do is teach teachers evidence-based strategies that go with any curriculum supporting language. And so we help teachers explicitly promote vocabulary skills of children throughout the day, to engage children in meaningful conversations. And we're even just working on, is there two conversational turns that is actually happening between the teacher and the child? Our research has shown when we do classroom observations, and teachers will get credit if there are these two conversational turns that occur, and we're like, please, please, please. It's like, oh, rats. And these conversational truly don't occur a lot in classrooms. There's a lot of talk, but that intimate conversation with children does not occur as much as we like. We work on promoting phonological awareness and also with the older children supporting decoding abilities, again in English in the home language. So the way the PD works, so we train teachers and assistant teachers. The reason, obviously, the assistant teachers are so critical because they may be the ones that are really speaking the home language in the classroom. But the teachers complete one online module a month. It's about an hour module, and what happens is we target 2 to 3 strategies that are evidence-based. They are provided with text, examples of exemplar videos of teachers using the strategies in the classroom. There's comprehension checks, and then they receive an assignment of of using these strategies in the classroom as part of their daily routines. They video record themselves. They reflect on the videos. They upload the videos to their coach, who then reviews them and meets with the teacher. They go over the glows and the grows, and they do that again for a second cycle, and then they move on to the next module. Throughout the PD, teachers are provided with classroom support, so we've curated a set of books that wherever possible, we have them in children's home languages, particularly Spanish and Chinese, which is even hard to get in those languages, but that we really have ample opportunities to support vocabulary and expressive language development. They get vocabulary photo cards for teaching, beginning and introducing vocabulary with explicit child-friendly definitions. We have reading guides that go along with the book that help teachers think about asking open-ended questions before, during, and after the reads, and then also integrating language and these vocabulary words throughout the day in large group, small group activities as well. We provide all of these materials in English, Spanish, and Chinese. And we also have a family newsletter website that parallels the books and the themes. And so within those are just some of the vocabulary words and conversational activities that parents can easily do at home. It's not like they have to go create some special event, and then they either at home or in the community, and all of those are available in 8 different languages, so the parents that do not speak English, we want to develop that home language and support that home language. Randomized controlled trials of Excel have shown that it is successful at improving teacher outcomes in terms of classroom quality. On the class, which many of you are probably familiar with, and also, so that's really important. A lot of PDs don't necessarily produce that, but even more importantly, we're able to get changes in children's vocabulary development and phonological awareness as compared to control groups. So our next step is to develop a 3-year-old version, and hopefully even younger ages. But our goal, as Catherine was talking about, is to have the PD within schools and programs so that teachers have had the same set of support so that children benefit from having consistent PD in classrooms.
Hi, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Marcel Mentor, and I am in the English education program. So I'm listening to my colleagues, and I'm trying to sift through what has already been said and what we already cover in our program. So in our program, we have certification for 7th through 12th grade. So many of our folk who come out of our program become the middle school and high school teachers that we see in classrooms in English teaching. We have students in our program, and then we also have students who come in from other programs as electives, particularly in social studies, so the history teachers come. So we're looking at teaching for English per se as a subject, but then also for what it looks like to read across the content. And then we also have a real and established collaboration with the TESOL program, so as Sarah Kreider was speaking about as well, where people are getting a dual certification, so their students take our teaching of reading class. It's a prerequisite for our students, it's not for the others, and so for others we get guests across. And interestingly enough, we had somebody who was already certified as a speech pathologist and came back this past semester to do this class, right? And so it's really interesting for me as the instructor for this class, where the criticality of our approach of learning is very important, right? And that we have all these voices in the classroom that informs our practice as well as the teaching of reading. And so something that I do as a off the get-go before COVID, our first class would be at the Barnes and Nobles, right, at 84th. And there's a little graphic organizer, find 5 books that you remember reading, 5 of your favorite books, something you hated, something you liked, right? And so the conversation then becomes really for the teacher to walk alongside the student in terms of reading, right, and the instruction. Like if I ask the question now, how many of you still read for fun? How many of you read for fun? Oh, that's very interesting. I love the hands. I love that most of TC students say there is no time to read for fun, right? And so how do we teach students to read for fun and enjoyment and for pure engagement with text? And I love the nod to texts are not just written texts, but they're also the podcasts, they're also the tweets, they're also the Instagram posts and the TikTok videos. These are texts, and how we as teachers keep up to date with what our students are engaging with, especially in the middle school and high school range, where we find a huge capacity where students are bored or not interested, or they're reading things that have literally no clue about their own engaged life. We talk about things like what it means to read the canon. Is the canon valuable? Right, and so my evaluations have indicated that I may be a little heavy on theory, and my students know, and I do take my evaluations very seriously, but I do believe that the theory informs our practice. And so in our program, there is a breadth of theory, both in the teaching of reading classes, but then also our methods classes, right, and so our program stands on 3 pillars, and one of them is social justice. And so when we're teaching for social justice, as my colleague Sarah Kreider was pointing out, who are we reading? Who gets to be canon? How do we teach our teachers to summarize texts for students so that they are age appropriate, right? Because we are also working with students who have, as she said, brought families across the borders. How do we teach a 16-year-old? In our reading classes, we do reflections, and then we have a capstone assignment called the reader case study that takes the length of the semester to complete. One of my students this past semester in her reflection said, I was not prepared to teach an 11th grade student how to read. Nothing had prepared me for the idea that I had to teach my student to read. And the student is highly efficient in everyday things. They fetch their siblings from school, they prep dinner as their parents are coming home, they do all grown-up things, and reading is a struggle. And she said to me, how do I do that? And I was like, that's a great question for discussion, let's do that, right? Let's talk about how we teach around that. Something else that I'm particularly interested in doing is banking resources, right? So that we don't recreate the wheel, and so that we have this idea of a cohort approach, so that there are shared Google documents already being established. The wonderful thing about our program too, we have in-service folk who are getting their certification, so we have people in schools full-time, but we also have folk who have literally come out of their undergrad and are brand spanking new to grad school. And so it makes for interesting critical discussions. We also have a huge number of international students in our programs that come to the teaching of reading class, and people who go back to New York State, to the greater USA, but then also into the international world to teach from our program. I think I've said
Okay,
a lot.
you win a prize too.
Oh,
Good
do
job.
I? Yay!
So the prize, by the way, is a champagne toast in my office afterwards. So before I go on to any prepared questions, do you have things that you'd like to pull on from each other?
I just wanted to comment that I noticed and appreciated the recognition that our programs have a lot to do with who is in them. and that brings such richness to us. That we're working with students who have such varied strengths and backgrounds, and so just as we're trying to help our students to be, responsive to their students, that we just are I thought this panel especially was just full of talk, and appreciated what you were saying about the English Ed program with all these different people from around the college coming together. My students benefit so much from studying, Susan, with you, because that's, again, they become richer, we all become richer because of the other courses that they take.
Thank you. Anyone else? All right, so as you are out in schools and talking with your in-service teachers and school leaders, what are some things that you're seeing in the contexts that they're in that you address in your literacy teacher preparation?
I can go. We see a range of things happening within the same school, for example, right? How, for example, one particular cooperating teacher operates differently in their classroom, and so we have students who get different experiences in their student teaching, right? What it looks like to be mentored by someone, but then also what it means to be having a voice in your own mentorship, what that means, like to ask questions, guiding questions, leading questions, so that you can get what you take from the program in terms of your student teaching and in-classroom experience. So that's one thing, right? Like, what does it look like when one person is experiencing this with a cooperating teacher and somebody else is not experiencing the same thing and their experience is different? And so I love that in our program, especially in the reflective writing and the reflective conversations that happen, people get a chance to speak about their experience, because I think the more we know, the more we can do with what we know, and maybe try to work towards some kind of clarity. And then also in our program, that helps us assess who's a good cooperating teacher and who we should not invite again to be a cooperating teacher. And so what that looks like to mentor people out of positions of guiding our students, because we always want people to feel like they are listened to, that they are heard, and that they are growing, I think is very important.
I think one of the problems that we come in with is even within the program itself, and also when I do my outside PD, is how am I going to fit it all in? I don't have time during the day. I don't have time to explicitly teach phonics. I don't have time to explicitly teach vocabulary. When we're looking at suitability for text, and I try to encourage them, don't look at readability level, look at background knowledge, look at syntax structures, look at the language that's used in the text. So, I don't have time. When am I going to do this? And how do I differentiate? So I feel for classroom teachers. I don't know how I would get it all in. And I think we're teaching an ideal, but I think we have to be able to realize that there's a reality to what goes on in the classroom too, and how to be efficient and effective in that respect.
Yeah, it makes me wonder how much in our teacher preparation we should be focusing on the structures in the United States versus other countries also, and making people more activist oriented. I mean, the United States has one of the very lowest number of hours per week of collaborative teacher and individual teacher planning time. Korea has the highest. Japan has a very high number also. So, what are we doing there in terms of giving teachers that thinking space and thinking time? We've heard a lot about, or a little about, informal assessments, which I think if we had a whole session on just informal literacy assessments, we could spend at least all day. But those informal literacy assessments are lovely in the moment and on the spot, but they make a lot more, you can get a lot more use out of them if you look over time. And you look, both within a student and across students as you do your instructional planning. So when do teachers do that? And as we kind of ramp up mandates, You know, this is mandated, this is mandated, this is mandated, and how many of those mandates are actually at cross purposes a lot of times also. So I think one of the roles university teacher educators need to play a lot more is stepping up and defending the structural limitations that mitigate against our being able to do these, you know, great practices. Thank you. So I'm going to, unless someone has something they want to add, yeah,
I will add,
go.
on a different level, I think also thank you. I think we also give teachers permission to work on oral language and to talk with children. I think there's often a struggle, unfortunately, because of things that are mandated, things that are very beneficial for children. And so I'm not denying those, but a lot of times, time to talk, to read books, to enjoy books, to teach vocabulary, to have conversations. So that's what I hope that we're able to do, but yet at the same time, it's a struggle. Teachers aren't always permitted to spend that time.
And I just might want to add that as Catherine mentioned earlier today, we have some 31 states with legislative mandates, and so all over the country we see communities where teachers have spent decades developing a toolkit of strategies, of materials, of methods that they've refined and innovated off of and developed with responsive to their own local communities, and that they're being asked to push all that aside and to adopt one of 3 or 4 core reading programs where every child will be reading the same text, and then the same snippet of a text, and then answering questions in a little workbook. And that's happening in, you know, states like Connecticut and Massachusetts, as well as in New York City. So I think watching school leaders say, how can I lead a school when I do not believe in the curriculum? What will I say when parents come in and say my child is bored? Teachers saying, how can I teach in ways that are totally antithetical to all that I've been studying for 20 years and to what I have grown to love. So I see that as a big issue.
And that's exactly why we called this panel One Size Does Not Fit All. You know, I always think back to the one-room schoolhouse and how those teachers were able to accelerate learning for students who were rapid learners and kind of engage in repeated instruction for kids who needed it. I think about Finland, where every classroom has 2 teachers, one who does pre-teaching and reteaching that's based on direct informal assessments in the moment.